That's the ejection seat.
Yes.
And it's random. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out for our first Budget Subcommittee 3 hearing of the year. We are going to begin while we await the arrival of other members who are going to be trickling in as we proceed. But we're going to begin with the first item, which is the overview of the Environmental Protection Agency, and Secretary Rodriguez is here to make that presentation. Welcome, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And I know you've got a full agenda and you're interested in discussing the cap and trade expenditure plan, so I'll be brief in just highlighting that the Cal EPA budget is a $3.5 billion budget. That includes the budget for the Office of the Secretary, as well as the 6 boards, departments, and offices that are in Cal EPA. That is Cal Recycle, the Air Resources Board, the State Water Resources Control Board, and the regional boards, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments, Department of Pesticide Regulation, and the Department of Toxic Substances Control. Of that $3.5 billion, I want to rush to add that only 1.5% is general fund, and the Office of the Secretary has a very modest portion of that budget of only $18 million and 69 positions. Though I will note that that's a 15% reduction in positions since actually a 20% reduction in positions since 2011. So we've tried to have a leaner, meaner Office of the Secretary. So I'm available to answer any questions that you might have about the budget, though, as I said, as I understand it, the real issue that the subcommittee will be concerned with today is the cap and trade expenditure plan. And on that plan, let me just say that I think that it is appropriate that you do have a panel here to discuss the plan today, because the development of that expenditure plan really was a team effort on behalf of all the members of the administration, Cal EPA, ARB, Department of Finance, and many of the other secretaries in the administration were involved in the development of that expenditure plan. It's been looked at by our attorneys, and we really feel like it's a good plan for implementing AB 32. So with that, I'll start. I'll stop taking your time and let you ask me any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Secretary Rodriguez. Do we have any questions from the dais? There appear to be none, but before you get up, let's just make sure there may be public comment. Is there anyone who would like to be heard on this particular item? Nobody's standing up, so I thank you for your concise report and look forward to working with you over the coming year.
Thank you very much.
And now we'll move on to what I think everyone understands is the main event today, the cap and trade expenditure plan. And I'll correct myself, this is actually our second budget hearing. We had the drought hearing a couple of weeks ago. How soon we forget. So let me begin with a couple of brief remarks on cap and trade, and I think we all probably recall it was back in 2006 that AB 32, also known as the Global Warming Solutions Act, and authored by then Assembly member, now Senator Fran Pavley, and former Speaker Fabian Nunez, was signed into law. And that landmark legislation committed California to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 25% to 1990 levels by the year 2020, and cemented us here in California not only as a national but a global leader in the fight against climate change. By most accounts, we seem to be well on our way to meeting our greenhouse gas emissions reduction target, and much of this success can be attributed to the cap and trade program. In fact, based on existing data and trends, the cap-and-trade program will be responsible for approximately 30% of the greenhouse gas emission reductions needed to meet our 2020 goal. Today, we're here to discuss how to spend about $850 million in cap-and-trade auction proceeds. So far, these auctions have netted the state $663 million since November of 2012. And through 2020, that total could reach $15 billion, a sizable amount for the legislature and the governor to use to reduce greenhouse gas. But as a wise and great sage once said, with great power comes great responsibility. Now, that wise sage was Uncle Ben speaking to Spider-Man, and I'd like to thank my chief of staff for the quote. But it is an appropriate one, because as we move forward, we have the responsibility to ensure every reasonable attempt is made to get the greatest greenhouse gas reduction per dollar invested. We also have the responsibility to demonstrate, through the use of accepted standard metrics, the potential greenhouse gas emissions reductions before any investment is actually made. There must be sufficient data collection and analysis to justify continued funding. And this transparency and accountability is critical to the long-term sustainability and really the sustainability amongst the public of the cap-and-trade program. People expect and deserve no less. As we move forward, we also need to think big. Why is that? Well, because California, despite California being a global leader in environmental protection and leading the nation in energy efficiency standards, we are the 12th largest carbon emitter in the world, and our population is only going to increase over the coming years. So for these reasons alone, we have a responsibility to think beyond 2020. 2020 is really right around the corner if you think about it. We have to be thinking long range. The governor's budget proposes $850 million of cap-and-trade auction revenues to programs that will, quote, promote greenhouse gas reductions and meet SB 535 goals, end quote. Many other groups around the state have alternative proposals, and believe me, I'm hearing from them. However, before any of these proposals should be considered, it really is incumbent upon the administration and all others with thoughts on how to apportion these funds to provide acceptable data and analysis demonstrating that the investment will achieve sufficient greenhouse gas reductions. With that, I'd like to welcome Assemblymember Wes Trespro, the chair of the Natural Resources Committee, the Assembly Natural Resources Committee, who recently held a hearing on the scoping plan update, to make opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to join you today. This is the expenditure plan, along with the scoping plan update, are some of the most important documents for the future of this state and our planet that we could be considering. At that hearing on the scoping plan update, there was a lot of focus on what the cap-and-trade revenue should be for and whether or not we can set up adequate standards or metrics for making sure that we get the maximum amount of greenhouse gas reduction benefit from the use of those funds. And I think as the legislature, that's one of our very important roles, both because we want to maximize the reduction of carbon, but also because we want to reduce the potential in the future going forward and setting any precedents for not having those metrics, and therefore having future legislatures and the governor viewing this as just another source of revenue in order to solve other fiscal problems. So I think it's very important from the very beginning that we set a very high standard of demonstrating that's how the funds will be spent, and that the precedent not be set that we begin to go some other direction. And I'm not, of course, accusing the administration of doing as any such thing, except to say that I think each expenditure needs to be measured in that light, and we have to go through that process in order to assure the public that we're on the job, and future legislatures will be hopefully view it as a precedent. So you're on the right track. I'm glad to be able to join you and listen in, and thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chesbrough. And now that he's properly identified, Assemblymember Gordon, any remarks? All right, great. Then I'd like to welcome our panelists and ask them to step forward. We have Matt Almy, the Assistant Program Manager from the Department of Finance, Mary Nichols, Chair of the California Air Resources Board, Brian Kelly, Secretary of the California State Transportation Agency, and Tiffany Roberts, the Senior Fiscal and Policy Analyst from the LAO. Welcome, everyone. I assume you all have your order worked out, so we'll just let you
thank you.
Proceed.
Good morning. Matt Almy, Department of Finance. The governor's budget proposes $850 million of cap-and-trade proceeds for existing and pilot programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through clean transportation, sustainable communities, energy efficiency, carbon sequestration, and waste diversion. Specifically, the budget proposes $300 million for rail modernization projects, including high-speed rail, to improve mobility and increase transit ridership. $300 million to accelerate the transition to low-carbon freight and passenger transportation and implement sustainable community strategies. $140 million for energy efficiency and clean energy projects, including $20 million already approved by the legislature in emergency drought relief package for water use efficiency projects that will support water conservation measures. And then finally, $110 million for natural resources and waste diversion projects that restore wetlands, enhance forest health, and divert materials from landfills. The legislature will have an opportunity to evaluate all of the specific components of the cap-and-trade expenditure plan over the coming months. And as the legislature considers the administration's proposal, I would like to emphasize that the cap-and-trade expenditure plan is not a listing of standalone separate programs, but is a cohesive package of integrated programs that is designed to achieve both immediate short-term emission reductions and long-term transformational changes necessary to reduce the ongoing risks of climate change. Specifically, the cap-and-trade expenditure plan reflects a balanced portfolio of proposed investments that further the purpose of AB 32. Specifically, the plan was informed by public comments received in 3 separate workshops convened throughout the state, resulting in the May 2013 investment plan. It supports programs that advance GHG reductions in sectors with the greatest emissions: transportation, energy, waste, and natural resources. It benefits disadvantaged communities disproportionately impacted by pollution as directed by SB 535. It emphasizes programs that provide additional benefits such as job creation, water use efficiency, which is particularly important in light of the state's current drought conditions, improved transportation mobility, and climate resiliency as required by AB 1532. It also builds on state climate strategies, including the draft update of the AB 32 scoping plan, the draft governor's environmental goals and policy report, the climate change indicators report, and other climate programs and statutes, and reflects a mix of both state programs and grant programs designed to support local and regional efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. To ensure accountability, the administration is proposing to update and develop methodologies for transportation, energy, and natural resources programs, which will be utilized by each implementing agency to ensure emission reduction calculation methods are uniform across similar programs and consistent with regulatory and planning protocols. Finally, pursuant to AB 1532, the administration is required to submit an annual report to the legislature on outcomes of the projects funded from cap-and-trade. This evaluation allows the legislature to evaluate the success of the program and inform future investment plans. Now, Secretary Kelly would like to make a few comments.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members, Senator, Assemblymember Gordon, good to see you. I think my task here is to outline the transportation elements of the cap-and-trade program that is before you in the budget context this year. Before I do, I just want to give a sort of very brief, broad sense of the trend in the transportation world with respect to investments generally, and most of it is being driven by regional activity, not statewide activity. In response to laws established with the enactment of AB 32 and SB 375, regions all over California are adopting 20 and 30-year transportation plans designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. Of course, from this sector, we're now responsible for about 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in California. These regions are proposing to achieve this by targeting transportation investments in a way to reduce total per capita vehicle miles traveled as one key element in their strategy to meet mobility and safety objectives while also meeting sustainability objectives. Regions and local governments are investing more in the preservation of the existing assets, in a broader suite of mobility choices for the public, like public transit, enhanced bicycle and pedestrian facilities, and in transit-oriented development projects that place commercial and housing development near convenient transit centers, and in other strategies to accommodate growth more efficiently, preserving agricultural land and natural resources. While much of the focus has been on activity at the regional level to date, the state has a very important role to play in fulfilling this vision of a transportation system that can meet our collective mobility, safety, and sustainability objectives over the coming decades. The use of cap-and-trade funds to modernize our passenger rail systems and develop a clean, fast, and efficient high-speed rail system connecting Northern California, the Central Valley, and Southern California is a key and necessary component of the state's strategy. The cap-and-trade expenditures in the governor's budget are very consistent with both the ARB scoping plan to reduce GHG emissions and the priority investments for our transportation system. Cap-and-trade expenditures in the transportation area include $300 million for rail modernization, $100 million for implementing sustainable community strategies through the Strategic Growth Council, and $200 million for the Air Resources Board's clean vehicle programs. On rail modernization, a couple of comments. The largest component, of course, of the investment strategy is rail modernization. We're proposing to spend about 1/3 of the total cap-and-trade program in this area. Here we've structured our cap-and-trade proposal very similar to the construct of SB 1029, which was legislation you all passed in 2012 and was enacted to appropriate the initial $8 billion of state and federal funds for both the development of high-speed rail in California and for related improvements in existing commuter, urban, and inner-city rail services. The investment of cap-and-trade funds in the development of high-speed rail in California is an appropriate use of these funds due to the transformative nature of the project and the corresponding reduction in GHG emissions from operating a high-speed rail system. The High-Speed Rail Authority has submitted to the legislature a report projecting significant reductions in GHG emissions from early investments of Proposition 1A in clean rail modernization projects, most significantly the Caltrain electrification project along the peninsula and the Bay Area. A commitment to green construction practices during project development and from the initiation of operating service in 2022, culminating in cumulative reductions of CO2 emissions in excess of 3.5 million metric tons by 2030, the equivalent of removing hundreds of thousands of vehicles from California's roadways. Methodologies used in the authority's projections have been reviewed by the ARB and the statutorily created peer review group that oversees much of the work of the High-Speed Rail Authority, and those projections have been deemed reasonable and credible. More importantly, they are in line with actual results from other places around the world, and I think this is a key point. All over the world, in Spain, Japan, France, and other places where high-speed rail is operating, the state of service along various routes was followed by the start of service along those various routes was followed by a significant shift in how travelers were moving between destination cities. Carbon-intense vehicle and air travel was cut dramatically in favor of cleaner, electrified high-speed rail. For example, prior to the introduction of the high-speed rail along the Madrid to Seville route in Spain, about 19% of the trips between those cities were taken via passenger rail. After the first full year of high-speed rail, that number jumped to 52%. Today, nearly 90% of the trips between Madrid and Seville are completed via high-speed rail. Again, this example is repeated in numerous places around the world. The GHG benefits from this mode shift are dramatic. On a per-passenger, per-mile basis, electrified high-speed rail emits a fraction of GHG compared to more carbon-intense bus, automotive, and air travel. These real-world results are instructive for California's transportation future. Transportation infrastructure investments in the era of climate change have to deliver more than just mobility benefits. They must also deliver on sustainability and public health objectives. The proposed rail modernization program contained in the cap-and-trade program does exactly that. Of course, cap-and-trade is still a new program. Future levels of auction proceeds are not known with great precision. The budget proposal has 33% of the proceeds directed to high-speed rail on an ongoing basis. The level of ongoing proceeds generated will help determine when and how we may leverage additional public and private sources of funding, including innovative federal financing for the project. The totality of the cap-and-trade proposal in this plan helps the state make investments in transportation solutions that meet our key objectives of mobility, safety, and sustainability. In addition to the development of the transformative HSR project, the cap-and-trade proposal will improve and expand service on intercity, urban, and commuter rail systems. It fosters implementation of SB 375 Sustainable Communities programs through the work of the Strategic Growth Council, and it funds the ARB's clean vehicle programs to bring clean vehicles onto our existing transportation infrastructure. With that general overview, I'm happy to conclude there and answer any of your questions as we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members. I just want to underscore a couple of the points that have been raised by Mr. Almy and by Secretary Kelly, highlighting the primary purpose of AB 32, which of course is to mitigate climate change. Cap and trade is one strategy in a suite of measures designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with that ultimate goal in mind. The Governor's proposed expenditure plan includes a mix of near-term and long-term strategies for reducing emissions, and in so doing furthers the goals of AB 32. It also achieves important co-benefits, such as investing in disadvantaged communities, as provided by SB 535, promoting job creation, and achieving reductions in other air pollutants. As Mr. Almy indicated, it's a balanced set of programs. The Governor's proposed budget is consistent with a 3-year investment plan that the administration put forward last year. The investment plan was developed through an extensive public process that included several workshops throughout the state and hundreds of comments submitted by interested stakeholders and members of the public. The proposed plan will result in significant greenhouse gas reductions from those sectors that are the largest contributors of emissions, and it's proportional in that sense to the scope of the problems. It also, I think, achieves a thoughtful balance between the near-term and the longer-term reductions that are needed. We must lay the foundation for future reductions if we hope to make an enduring contribution to reversing climate change and protecting our most vulnerable communities from its worst impacts. And with that, I will just be available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Tiffany Roberts from the Legislative Analyst Office, and this morning my comments are based on our recently released cap and trade budget report that evaluated the expenditure plan that is being proposed by the administration. In the report, we lay out some background on cap and trade and provide a review of the Governor's cap and trade expenditure plan and provide some recommendations on the plan as well as the approach to appropriating these funds. As you've heard from Mr. Almy's testimony, the Governor's 14-15 budget proposes to appropriate $850 million in auction revenue to various state programs, including programs related to sustainable communities, clean transportation, energy efficiency, natural resources, and waste diversion. In order to minimize the potential negative economic impact that cap and trade could have on the economy, it's important that auction revenues be invested in a way that maximizes greenhouse gas emission reductions. Maximizing emission reductions reduces the demand for allowances, thereby putting downward pressure on the price of allowances. And this is important because to the extent that we are able to do that, we are also able to potentially forego some of the potential leakage associated with cap and trade. You also have the ability to reduce the potential impact on the economy at large, as well as consumers, businesses, energy ratepayers, etc. Now, in reviewing the governor's proposed expenditure plan for cap and trade auction revenue, we find that there's significant uncertainty regarding the degree to which the proposal would maximize emission reductions. This uncertainty is the result of several factors, including there being only limited data and analysis provided by the administration on proposed activities. In addition, the level of emission reductions achieved would depend on the specific projects funded by departments. Consequently, it's very difficult for the legislature to have assurance at this point that the activities proposed by the administration would achieve the greatest reduction per dollar invested, or whether a different set of programs might yield a greater return on investment. Next, the governor's plan lacks a coordinated approach to metrics and oversight. Under the governor's proposed approach, each department is going to be responsible for developing its own set of criteria to determine how to spend cap and trade revenue. This raises several concerns. First, departments won't necessarily have a means to evaluate the potential GHG emission reductions of proposed projects. While ARB has a BCP to develop metrics to be used by departments to evaluate investment outcomes, they don't intend to provide metrics to departments to assist in their investment decision-making process. Furthermore, the administration currently doesn't intend to provide a means for departments to evaluate potential co-benefits either, such as public health impacts. Consequently, it's unclear whether these departments, most of which don't have the experience evaluating greenhouse gas emission reductions, will be able to knowledgeably identify the specific activities most likely to reduce emissions. In addition, the administration has indicated that it won't provide departments with specific guidance on how to weigh GHG emission reductions relative to co-benefits or other considerations when evaluating how they'll spend their appropriations. It's unclear, for example, what criteria departments administering grant programs will use to evaluate grant proposals and whether the level of GHG emission reductions will be given top priority in the scoring of these proposals. Lastly, the administration has not established GHG reduction goals for the various programs proposed for funding. So while many programs might ultimately demonstrate that they reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it won't be clear whether they achieved more or less than what was expected at the time that the legislature appropriates the funding. Given these concerns, we've made some recommendations. First, as I mentioned, ARB has a proposal to create metrics for the departments to use in order to evaluate investments after the fact. We find that this proposal has some merit, but we would suggest going a step further. We would recommend that the legislature approve the request and then direct the board to use the staff to develop metrics to be used to evaluate potential investments before projects are funded. We also recommend that the legislature direct ARB to establish a set of guidelines that include direction for departments regarding how they should incorporate these metrics into their decision-making processes. Having such metrics to use as part of the department's decision-making process would provide greater certainty regarding greenhouse gas emission reductions for potential projects. While this might delay getting funding out the door by a short while, we find that such a short delay would be worthwhile if this were to increase the likelihood that the state could better ensure that the most beneficial projects are being funded. In order to ensure that all departments use a consistent set of criteria to develop and implement their programs, the ARB should develop guidelines on how criteria such as the potential GHG impact and co-benefits for grant applications are to be weighted. These guidelines should include how the metrics are to be used as part of a department's decision-making process. Guidelines should also include parameters and directions for departments' grant-making programs. The parameters should align overall with AB 32's primary goal of maximizing greenhouse gas emission reductions in a cost-effective manner. And with that, I will conclude, and I'm happy to take your questions.